Oh, those lights are bright.
Yeah.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Ron Miller. I write about the enterprise for TechCrunch. And we're going to talk about data today. Data has become increasingly important in recent years as it becomes the fuel for artificial intelligence, for growing customer customization. But, data collection, as we all know, has a dark side. And there's a growing demand for people to control their own data. Just yesterday at the keynote, Tim Berners-Lee said this: GDPR is a regulation in the EU, but I see all over the world the conversation on privacy has changed. So this presents huge challenges for business, and who have been collecting data for the most part up until now, up until GDPR, without limits, and not always in the most responsible ways. So as businesses have taken liberty with data, government moved in to regulate that usage, and that regulation becomes both friction for businesses and it becomes an opportunity for businesses. So depending on how you look at it. So we're going to talk about data etiquette. We're going to talk about some of those issues today. But before we get started, I'm going to let these two gentlemen briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll jump right into the questions.
Great.
Cool. Yeah, I'm Peter. I'm the co-founder and CEO at a company called Segment. We help companies manage all of their customer information, so we help them move their customer data from point A to point B, and generally are helping companies untangle the sort of rat's nest of data pipelines that they've built in the background to make their businesses function. We were founded in 2012, and we're a little over 300 people based in San Francisco.
Great. I'm Chris Powell. I'm with Commvault. We're a little bit older. We're the old people in the room, with 20-year-old software company in the data space. And we work with companies all over the world, and it really comes down to three things. They're trying to figure out ways to best protect, to manage for a lot of the things we're going to talk about here today around GDPR and other policies, and also use the data, get value from it. So we offer a leading software portfolio that meets those three needs for companies of all sizes.
So let's start off with a general question. What impact has this growing call for data regulation had on your businesses and on business in general, on your customers, and on what you're seeing in the world in general? You want to start, Chris? Or?
Sure. Well, look, in terms of the need for companies to look at ways that they can manage the overall the regulations that are hitting, the new regulations that we're seeing here in Europe with GDPR, I think we see certain business leaders coming out and welcoming some of the regulation, which is a bit unusual. But I think the situation is one that there were 28 different laws that you needed to try to comply with within the European Union. And that needed to be brought under control. When we were talking backstage before we started, you could almost think of the data industry as it's in its very early infancy, if you will, in the world. It's the Model T era of data. And it's you can imagine the financial services industry, if it didn't have some of the regulations that put in place that established some of the commonality that we can operate under, that it would make things actually more difficult for us. So we're seeing it impacting our business quite a lot, but I think the mood is shifting to one that is cautiously optimistic about what can happen.
Yeah, and I think many businesses talk about sort of the burden that new regulations like GDPR put on them, but we actually have a pretty different perspective at Segment. We feel like the laws are really sort of a reflection of what actual people want, how end consumers feel about their data and how that data is being moved and sold and so forth. And the regulations are really a reflection of that. And if you are a brand who wants to build trust with your end consumers, with your users, then you really need to focus on what those end users really want. And so we see the GDPR as a very positive thing. I think there's a number of regulations coming down the pipe in California, in Brazil, in the US, most likely, that similarly I think can be very positive in terms of reflecting the actual reality of what end users and consumers really want.
I mean, I think it's clear that consumers want more control over their data, but it seems like the brands that you just referenced are not doing that. They're using the data whatever the law allows them to do, and I'm wondering why you think brands haven't taken more control here and waited for the government to make that kind of regulation.
Yeah, I think in any industry, it's initially unregulated. You see a massive flowering of use cases in different ways that people use the sort of optionality that's available to them as aggressively as possible. And one of those ways today is using third-party consumer data that's bought and sold. And I think the reality is that that's not actually a super healthy way of doing business for a lot of reasons that we can get into. But first-party data usage actually is sort of a totally different ballgame, and that's really sort of GDPR is pushing away from third-party data towards the use of internal first-party data of all the interactions that you have with your own customers. And so I think really what you're seeing is not necessarily data overall, but really a focus on interacting with your customers in authentic ways for how they have interacted with you directly. And I think we'll see companies refocus on that in a way that they haven't.
Yeah, I think Peters mentions the word trust. I think trust is at the heart of this. There's a Zig Ziglar quote, an old business leader, that talked about if you like someone, you'll listen to them, but if you trust them, you'll do business with them. And I think that's while we're in early days with some of the things that are occurring, I think you're right. We've seen bad behavior. We see bad behavior in a lot of different places. But the companies that early adopt a lot of these changes, get control over these things, can establish better trust with their customers and gain more customers.
I think maybe to answer your question more specifically, like what companies are really sort of abusing third-party data? Oftentimes it's actually publishers, and it's because they're using data sort of under the covers in a way that isn't directly interacting with the customers, but they're using it to increase the price of an ad. And so when data gets used in those sort of indirect ways, I think is where you see the worst abuses.
We talk about all the negative ways to use data. I mean, you alluded to the idea of positive ways to use data, and I was wondering, data can help you customize the experience. It can also be used in ways that people are not very comfortable with. So how do you kind of flip the conversation a little bit and say, we're using data, but this is how we're using data, and is maybe transparency the answer here that we're not seeing?
Yeah.
I think if you think back to visiting a bank branch, let's say like 20 or 30 years ago, you'd wander into the bank branch, and the bank branch manager would probably know who you were. Like when I did this when I was growing up in Seattle, my parents had a home loan and a car loan and a bank account and a safety deposit box, and I was constantly exchanging coins because I had a coin collection. And so, they knew who I was, and I expected them to know, and when I walked in, they would greet me and say, oh, that's the coin kid. And that's a wonderful neighborhood kind of experience because the person you're interacting with really knows who you are. But if you look now at how you interact with a bank, you interact with a bank via a mobile app, a website, a teller, an ATM, like a phone call center. There's all these different ways that you interact with them, and they have absolutely no idea who you are. They ask for your credentials 6 times in a row.
Right.
And so that digital experience is quite bad as compared to what it was in the neighborhood bank branch. And so I think sort of using first-party data is a way to actually tie together all these digital channels again into providing a good experience, which is like the teller being able to say, I'm so sorry that you just encountered an error on the ATM. Maybe I can refund your checking fees for the next 2 months so that you'll really stay with the bank. And that would be an amazing experience based on first-party data. And I think there's a lot more opportunity for that hasn't been tapped yet.
Yeah, for sure. Peter's point about first-party data is the key. I mean, I remember when I go home, I buy my glasses. You go to the store, and it's the same one I bought the glasses at 6 months previously. I've lost these glasses, and if they know who I am, I don't even have to go into the store. They can just send me a new pair, right? So there's a lot of positives that can come from this. I think the expectations that companies need to put on themselves, the software as a service acronym, I sort of have a different as a service acronym that we like to use, which is when you think of the data, it needs to be available, appropriately used, and secure. And that's what companies that are choosing to collect customer data and really the customers entrust them with it. The fact that data is available so that they can create a good experience, but it's used in appropriate ways, and that's a level of trust, and that it's secure, that you're not making it available or potentially something that third-party bad actors can have access to, is something you need to manage.
So one of the things that we were talking a little bit about earlier is the idea of, when government comes in, it can be done well or it can be done badly. And what is the danger of regulations done badly in terms of quashing innovation in what's really still a developing? You said, I think it was one of you said it was still in its infancy. So what is the danger here of the regulation not doing what it's intended, that is the unintended consequences of regulation?
I don't think we've seen a regulation yet that's sort of overreaching in its negative impacts. I think there was There were laws passed in the EU and so forth maybe like a decade or two ago around cookie laws. And I think those were ineffective, but they were sort of harmless in their ineffectiveness in the sense that everyone just clicked through the cookies and the cookies kept getting set. So they didn't really change anything, but they also didn't really harm that much of anything. Maybe there's a lot of clicks generated and a lot of time spent, but that's fairly minor in the sort of scheme of damage that could have been done.
Yeah. And I think when we see some of the things that nothing crazy happened in May when GDPR came into effect, and a lot of what happened in May was the first piece of this, which was they created a bit of a motivator, right? Although we haven't seen any crazy fines, there's certainly on paper a number of crazy fines. So regulation can go a bit badly if strictly enforced in the way that it is sort of vaguely defined. You can certainly end up with some things that create some bad situations for individual companies. But I think that's the phase we're in right now, is that these regulations are written in ways that are purposely vague in order for us to really fully understand and evolve this over time, and it'll be tested in different real-world use cases.
So
I will say that there was one surprising thing that did happen to us when GDPR went into effect in May. So one of the things that we can, because we send all this data out to all of these different places where it's used, into a data warehouse, email marketing tool, and so forth, we actually can now go clean up the data in all of those different places. So if there's a deletion request for a user, we can go delete it in all those places. And we were expecting a relatively small percentage of users to sort of go and delete the data. I will say the number, I won't talk about the percentages exactly, but the total volume of users actually deciding to delete their data was about 100 times higher than we expected.
Wow.
So it is substantial in its impact as opposed to the cookie laws from years ago.
Have you thought about why you think that is? Or
we haven't gotten to the bottom of why, but
yeah,
the consumer behavior is there.
So when somebody deletes their data, they're deleting the data within that particular brand, within that particular moment, and then they can start over, right? Or are they just opting out completely? How does it work in?
You can do both.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm hearing here is that technology got us into this, and maybe technology can get us out of it. How do you think technology can help get us over that hump of what GDPR and other regulations are trying to accomplish to give us that transparency and control that consumers seem to want, and your data is bearing out?
Yeah. So, I sort of think there's the great phrase of, or first there's the typical business scenarios you look at, right? It's not about the systems. It starts with the people and the process and the systems. And if you think about that standard way of looking at the world, where this really begins in a lot of ways is the process, and companies needing to look at fully defining what their processes are and how they need to be able to manage those. And then you can look at the systems, and you can look at training the people and changing some of your culture. I sort of look at the center piece as the process, and then everything else is around protect or trust but verify, right? You need to trust your system and also, or trust the people, I guess, and verify it with the systems is how we'll be able to move forward.
I think beyond the sort of ethics of the questions around data and consumer behavior and so forth, I think the reality is that it's actually quite a difficult engineering challenge to go and deal with implementing everything related to GDPR. And I think that is, to some extent, what companies talk about when they say the burden of GDPR. And I do think it is a real engineering challenge to go and provide all the options for opting out, the options for deleting requests, the options for updating information about each customer. And it's actually difficult to go into all of the systems where customer data has been distributed. And I do think there's a technological solution there. I don't think it's an area where there was any pressure to do things before, but I do think there's a technological solution there, and that's something that we hope to help with. Yeah.
A big piece of it may be around just consolidation. We did a survey with IDC, and they came out that 80% plus of the CIOs said that they had 10 copies of a typical database. So the number of copies, the different places that this data is going, is what makes it oftentimes very difficult. As the engineering of the right to be forgotten, I think one of the reasons the right to be forgotten is requested more is it's easy. It's easy to request it. It's really dependent on your systems that you've set up within your company, and if you go back 10 years, nobody set up their systems in a way that ever envisioned that somebody should be able to push a button to delete all their personal identifiable information.
Yeah, so
nobody set up that way.
There's actually sort of some competing effects here, right? Which is you have the emergence of more and more channels for communicating with a customer, but at the same time, this pressure to be able to delete it sort of wants you to centralize the data.
Yeah.
So there's sort of a pressure to centralize the structure and store and infrastructure of the data, but also a push to differentiate more and more channels for actually doing the communication on. So.
I mean, I think about your company, which I believe was founded in 1988, right? You obviously haven't been there since 1988, but...
Thank you.
But when you think about how things were done back then, I mean, it was all about, everything was in like this data silo, and nobody would have thought about, having to go in and protect it, because that was the business, was to protect the data.
Yeah.
From your perspective as an evolving company, that is looking and modernizing, how do you deal with that kind of change and say, okay, we're looking outward now and not just inward at data?
Yeah. Well, I guess the way that we've tried to couch this within our company, there's a number of things that are driving the needs. Compliance is one of them for sure. But also cyber attacks, cybercrime is driving it. The need to control costs and modernize your infrastructure is driving it. And one commonality across all of this is the need to consolidate and simplify. It's just as you said, Ron. There's so many systems that people have set up that require an individual application with its individual interface, with its individual policies, with its individual copies. And because this is permeated across so many organizations, you really need to get control of the data that feeds all of these.
And you're a company that was created much more recently.
For sure.
And I'm imagining when you started the company, you weren't thinking about, like having to erase all this data. So how has that changed kind of how you think about the product and your product development?
Yeah, I'd say even from the very beginning of Segment, we were pretty avid about only focusing on first-party data and not being interested in third-party data. I think the writing was sort of on the wall to us at the time that, I'd talk to my mom, and my mom would be like, why is this ad following me? Right. And I'm like, okay, well, it's clear that there's maybe an arbitrage happening between sort of like what consumers think and what companies are doing. That moment is going to go away eventually. And so let's stay wildly clear of that. Let's focus just on first-party data.
So from a marketing perspective, making things more individualized without abusing the user?
That's right, yeah, making things individualized based on the interactions they've actually had with a company to date.
All right. We have just about 45 seconds left. So in terms of the future, how do you see this playing out in terms of data protection moving forward?
Yeah, I think more companies can begin to embrace the ways that they can manage this overall environment. It helps them do a number of things. They can really take a look at their processes and modify them and improve them, look at the tools they're using in order to be able to manage them and maximize those tools in the different use cases. They can look at storage and minimize the amount of storage that's required for the data to support these things, and really just change that first thing we talked about. It's trust with their customers, change their customer experience.
And very quickly.
Yeah, I think the U.S. is most likely going to pass some sort of regulation in the next few years, and so I think there's a huge opportunity to sort of shape what that looks like. And to the question about dev teams potentially being liable for data breaches, I think there's interesting that the U.S. law actually is putting some liability and potential jail time for executives around consumer data breaches. So there's some interesting things there, but most likely it'll be covered by insurance, I think.
All right, let's give these guys a hand.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.